given that this targets trafficking and not necessarily addicts per se, at some point in time in the lives of these people, there was access to a drug, because beyond the biological process, there was access to drugs. So if we target drug trafficking, and if we reduce access to drugs, do you not believe that the people you treat who were young at one time and who had easy access at some point to drugs, they fell into the world of drugs because of the facility with which drugs were available beyond the biological, psychological, family issues, etc. Do you not think that in reducing access, in targeting trafficking itself, through one of the tools we will be able to combat the drug problem? But I agree, it isn't the only tool. Is that not some way of attacking the problem?
Senator, for your question. And we've had 100 years of evidence on whether or not trying to interdict the supply of drugs through legal means actually works. The evidence from anywhere in the world is that it doesn't matter how drastic and draconian you make the legal situation, it simply doesn't interdict the supply of drugs. There's an American judge, Judge Gray, I think he's in California, retired now, who said that trying to repeal the law of supply and demand is like trying to repeal the laws of gravity. You can't do it. So first of all, it's not a tool that works, number one. Number two, as Mr. Skinner pointed out, the distinction between addict and supplier is a very murky one, especially on the street level, because people sell stuff. Because their stuff is illegal, they have to commit crime in order to get the money for it. So then one of the ways that they raise money is by selling drugs to one another and to other people. So that in fact the illegality of it creates more traffic rather than diminishes the traffic. And as far as being one tool amongst others, you know, Wayne mentioned the four-pillar strategy of harm reduction, prevention, treatment, and law enforcement. But from my perspective, Senator, there are no four pillars in Canada. What we have is 3 toothpicks and 1 pillar. In terms of the amount of money that's devoted to each of these areas, overwhelmingly, it's the one that historically has been shown not to work, which is the legal enforcement, and the others that have been shown to work are starved for support. So that it's a question, too, of in a society, especially these days, when we're very conscious of finite economic resources available for social programs, where do we put the energy, where do we put the finances? And I'm saying is that we're putting it into the wrong effort based on all the evidence. And by the way, I appreciate the intention. I mean, there's no question that the intention behind the law is to stop a terrible thing from happening. So that I don't question the motivations of the minister or the governing party or of anybody who supports the legislation. But I'm saying that the evidence is just not there to support it.
I want to also say that if the intention seems clear, but when you look at it, really this becomes a tool in law enforcement. I think the low-hanging fruit are the people who are living on the street, and law enforcement already is pretty good at getting those individuals. And the logic of a mandatory minimum sentence is we don't care about the circumstances. If we got you, we're going to really hammer you with this, and you're going to have a serious penalty. And in a way, that can almost, the logic of that, it seems to me, can only be directed at people on the street. If we were fortunate enough to actually arrest somebody really high in that system, I would imagine the legal penalties that would come to them would be huge. And if we could actually describe their involvement in these activities. So that's my concern, is that this good intention actually will have an unintended negative effect of further actually creating punishments that are directed towards the more vulnerable people in our society, who already actually are, I think, highly policed in this area, and they don't have the supports that they need in the other 3 pillars, as Dr. Maté said. If you look at the seizure data from the RCMP, actually just the quantities of drugs that are seized every year, over 90% of the seizure data is about cannabis. There's and the amount of policing that's successfully directed against drugs like cocaine and heroin, crystal meth, ecstasy, it's trivial by comparison. The magnitude really is 90% plus cannabis seizures. So that also paints, I think, a disturbing picture, because the profile of cannabis use in Canada is very extensive. Actually, it's now approaching tobacco in terms of the annual prevalence of use. I think it's something like 17% of Canadians admit to having smoking cannabis in the past year. So, again, what are we doing with these policies, and what will be the directions of police enforcement? I think that's where we need to be. The intention is really sound. And again, I'm actually hopeful that there are more mature ways, if you will, that we could actually have more collaborative relationships between the four pillars and actually be working more successfully on these things. But the evidence is that this approach has a long history to it, and the evidence is just against it.
Another question with regard to addiction treatment. Members of my family were caught up in addiction problems, and I therefore was able to see that treatment was virtually impossible if the person didn't take it upon him or herself to decide that he or she was going to receive treatment. So how can we work on the person to lead that person to a decision? You gave the example of Peter earlier. It was an interesting story. He decided, after having gone to prison several times, after probably having met people and had support services when he was in prison, perhaps Peter would not have made that decision had he not had access to that, had he not gone to prison even, where he met people that led him along that intellectual path in order to decide one day to opt for treatment. Could we not use prisons in a different way, not just throwing people in prison or throwing away the key, but helping these people become sober again, have access to support systems, to assistance, in order to lead them to that decision? Could that not be a positive aspect of imprisonment?
It's certainly true that people choose at some point to undertake a path of recovery. The question is, what are the conditions that are needed to encourage that choice? No evidence that harsh punishments is the way. It's usually the opposite. The Catholic monk Thomas Merton wrote that before people can believe in victory, they have to have a taste of victory. And what that means is, in this context, is it means they have to experience support and compassion. Then they're much more likely to choose their recovery path. If negative consequences led people to choose recovery, then I wouldn't have any patients in the downtown east side, because you could not function and exist in a more harassed and troubled and deprived way than the people who live in the streets in Vancouver do. But it's still not enough to force them to give it up. It's precisely because the conditions for support are lacking. Now, it's true. When people come out of prison, my patients, when they come back from prison, they put on weight, they look healthier. They may have gone through a very difficult period of withdrawal, but now they had decent food, and they had a place to sleep, and a warm place to sleep, and they weren't out there in the streets, so they actually look better. And very quickly they relapse, because the fundamental issues have never been addressed. Now, it might be nice to say that if there's actually a decent treatment program in prison and support, but that's not on. It's just not what happens. What happens is that people are jailed under increasingly crowded conditions with other criminals, and it's a very harsh place to live. So that I don't know where it exists, this place where in jail people are getting the support that they need. And even then, the issue wouldn't be longer or harsher sentences. The issue would be providing them with support. So there's nothing to be said on the punitive side. No evidence in favor of it. It just doesn't work.